Greetings, welcome once again to Justified Nonetheless. I'm Kevin Berger, and I apply the principles of polemics and skepticism to atheism and the claims made by atheists. In this video, I'll be doing something a little different. I am someone who likes to dabble in philosophy, and last night, while I was bored at work, I began to philosophize, and in that process, I created a trolley problem of my own, then formulated a logical principle to address that problem, and then finally developed an argument to support that principle. So that's what I'll be presenting. The trolley problem goes like this. When considering whether to convince someone to abandon an unsubstantiated but potentially true belief, akin to redirecting a trolley onto a different track in the trolley problem, one faces an ethical dilemma involving potential harm, truth, and intervention. Which causes the greater harm? Allowing one to continue to hold an unsubstantiated belief, or persuading one to abandon a belief that may in fact be incidentally true? The principle, which I have named the principle of restrained intervention, is this. An observer is justified in persuading a subject to abandon an unsubstantiated belief if and only if either the falsity of or the inherent harm caused by that belief can be effectively demonstrated. The argument proceeds thusly. Premise 1. Before dismantling or convincing someone to abandon a belief, we should understand the reasons for that belief. That is Chesterton's fence. Premise 2. Removing a belief without understanding its purpose might lead to unintended consequences or the loss of valuable insights. That is the law of unintended consequences. Premise 3. Moral or belief judgments involve normative claims, oughts, that cannot be directly derived from purely factual observations, ises. That is Hume's guillotine. Premise 4. Convincing someone to abandon a belief involves a moral or normative judgment about what beliefs are acceptable. Premise 5. Respecting individuals' autonomy and personal liberty in matters of belief aligns with the principle of logical humility, acknowledging the limitations of our knowledge and refraining from imposing beliefs without sufficient justification. That is the humility principle. Premise 6. Even if a belief is unjustified, if it happens to be incidentally true, convincing someone to abandon that belief, despite good intentions and justification, may lead to greater harm than allowing the individual to persist in the unjustified belief. That is the precautionary principle. Principle 7. Demonstrating a universal negative, such as the non-existence of any deity, is inherently challenging. Therefore, because it cannot be empirically verified and is not a truth of logic, such a proposition may ultimately be meaningless. That is the principle of verification. Conclusion. Therefore, it is ethically sound to refrain from convincing someone to abandon a belief in the existence of a deity until there is sufficient evidence demonstrating its falsehood. This approach, incorporating the principles of Chesterton's fence, Hume's guillotine, the law of unintended consequences, logical humility, the precautionary principle, and the principle of verification, recognize the complexity, potential harm, and importance of respecting autonomy and intervening to change beliefs. Here are some additional thoughts that kind of go along with this. Should one attempt to argue against this principle from the standpoint that merely holding an unsubstantiated belief is harmful in and of itself, this can be rebutted that a greater harm is perpetrated by the intrusion and infringement upon one's autonomy and personal liberty, even if the belief is ultimately demonstrated to be false. And given that the belief could also ultimately be demonstrated to be true, it is potentially doubly injurious to the subject. Further, if one argues, for example, from the perspective of Clifford's principle that it is wrong always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence, there is a certain irony or inconsistency if the observer intervenes prematurely in someone else's belief without having gathered sufficient evidence to demonstrate its falsity. The same would be true of other philosophical razors, which emphasizes the importance of epistemic humility and consistency in applying epistemological principles. I think the promotion and hopeful adoption of this principle would force people to recognize the distinctions between theism, Gnosticism, and religion, which would be beneficial because it seems that more often than not, the arguments are against specific aspects of religion. This would force atheists to modify their argumentation to address the issues that they actually condemn and support, because I don't think the underlying issue has anything to do with the belief in the prose existence of a deity, which is what theism is. If they object to misogyny, then they should target misogyny with their arguments. If they object to homophobia, racism, or other forms of discrimination and prejudice, they should argue accordingly. Similarly, if they wish to promote reasoning, science, and secularism, they should argue in favor of those things. None of the above are part and parcel to whether or not a deity exists or belief to that effect. So there's no impetus for atheism or theism to be addressed at all. Indeed, I think that if the issues in question were addressed accordingly, both sides would find that they have far more commonalities. And there you have it. That's my trolley problem, my solution to the problem, and the justification for that solution. Don't know if it'll ever catch on. However, some food for thought at the very least. Until next time, remember, even if your beliefs aren't necessarily true, they should be justified nonetheless.